Welcome to this special breaking news edition of Star Cells and God. This is the podcast where we explore how the latest discoveries in science provide evidence for God's existence, God's character, and the reliability of scriptures. My name is Rana. I'm a biochemist and a Christian apologist, and I work for an organization called Reasons to Believe. This is the organization that sponsors this podcast, thanks to the generous donations of viewers and listeners like you. If you want to know how you can support Star Cells and God or learn about Reasons to Believe, go to our website, reasons.org. Also, you can follow us on social media, RTB_official. And then finally, make sure you go to our YouTube channel, Reasons to Believe, and subscribe. There you can gain access to all kinds of great video content exploring a wide range of questions involving science and the Christian faith. And then while you're there, go ahead and use the notification button so you can be alerted the next time a new episode of Star Cells and God drops. This is a new feature of the Star Cells and God podcast where we are going to respond to new discoveries that have generated excitement in the popular science press. And so we are going to try to provide a timely response to these Science in the News articles, giving you insight as to what the article is based on and how that discovery provides evidence for the Christian worldview. And it's in that spirit today that I want to talk about an article published by Carolyn Johnson in the Washington Post. This would be the April 16th edition of the Washington Post. And Carol Johnson writes an article that's entitled, "How Did Life on Earth Begin? Cracks May Have Been the Key." And this article that Carolyn Johnson wrote, which is a very fine piece, by the way, is based on and inspired by a paper published by a team of German researchers in one of the recent issues of the journal Nature, the April 4th, 2024 edition of Nature, in which they report the results of a prebiotic simulation set of studies that they claim provides insight into a key problem confronting a chemical evolutionary scenario for the origin of life, and also claim that their work addresses a significant issue confronting origin of life researchers, namely the issue of what we might call unwarranted researcher involvement. Let me give a little bit of background just to set the stage for this discovery, and then we can begin to unpack it and then look at its theological implications. You know, origin of life researchers are trying to explain how life could have emerged on early Earth. They argue that this must have been through some kind of chemical evolutionary process in which small molecules that would have been present on the early Earth react with each other to form essentially a prebiotic mixture of chemical compounds in some location on the early Earth, and that these materials would undergo reactions to form the building block materials of life, which would complexify and aggregate and organize into the very first cells. Now, origin of life researchers can't really travel in time to go back to the early Earth to observe what happened. The best they can do is to try to gain some clues from the geochemical and the geological record for the oldest rocks on Earth. But this is an incomplete picture where they are looking through the glass dimly. So what do? Well, they try to recapitulate the process of chemical evolution in a lab, where they start with simple materials and try to identify different chemical and physical processes that could have generated the building block materials of life and again led to their complexification, aggregation, and organization into the very first cells, where they envision this process occurring in a stepwise manner where each step is contributing and setting the stage for, again, the emergence of the very first life forms. This work is called work in prebiotic chemistry, or these are called prebiotic simulation studies. Now, the goal of these studies is really threefold. First is what we might call proof of principle. Does the chemistry or the physics even exist that could contribute to a particular step in the origin of life? The second goal would be if that indeed there is a chemical or a physical process that in principle could contribute to that step in the origin of life, what is the mechanism that undergirds that process? And then finally, they will need to be able to show that this particular process, in light of its mechanistic constraints, actually would operate under the conditions of the early Earth. They have to show that the reaction is geochemically relevant. Now, over the last 70 years, origin of life researchers have been wildly successful in fulfilling the first two criteria. They've identified a number of chemical and physical processes that in principle could contribute to the origin of life and have done a marvelous job of working out the mechanistic understanding of these chemical and physical processes. Where they have failed almost uniformly is establishing geochemical relevance for these processes. And the problem is what's known as unwarranted researcher involvement. And the idea here is that when you run a prebiotic simulation study, it has to be done in a chemistry lab, which means you have to set up some kind of reaction vessel or reaction apparatus that reflects the intelligence and the agency of the researcher doing the work. Then you have to establish chemically pristine conditions if you're going to make any sense of your results. There has to be a careful control of the initial conditions, including the identity of the solvent, its pH, its temperature. You have to control the headspace of the reaction, its compositional makeup. You have to add the right components at the right time in the right concentrations. You have to sometimes stop the reaction and isolate the intermediate products and purify them before you go to the next step of the reaction. You also have to monitor for undesired side reactions, many times stopping the reaction before the product continues to react to produce something that would be undesirable and invalid for the origin of life scenario. In other words, the ability to establish proof of principle and work out the mechanistic details requires researcher involvement. In fact, it's preferred because you need to be able to control these conditions. But what it does is completely undermines the geochemical relevance of the work to the point where there are many researchers who now feel as if the origin of life researchers have actually unwittingly involved themselves in the experimental design where intelligent agency becomes critical to affect a certain outcome when it comes to chemical evolution. And it's interesting towards this end that the German researchers in the introduction of their paper write these words that reflects, in a sense, this problem of unwarranted researcher involvement, where they say to uncover the details of such pathways and to map them reproducibly, laboratory experiments usually start with well-defined concentrations of previously purified reactants. Often a well-defined sequence of manual steps is required, such as the addition of further reactants or the selective purification of intermediates to increase the yield of the final products. Although high starting concentrations can be helpful, the number of side products substantially increases for complex reaction pathways. Therefore, without some form of intermediary purification, the reaction will result in vanishingly small concentrations of the desired product or even be completely inhibited. In other words, the success of these prebiotic simulation studies across the board for the last 70 years has been strongly influenced by the involvement of the researcher. And in fact, this was a theme of my book, Creating Life in the Lab, which was published in 2011. And in this book, I make a case that unwarranted researcher involvement actually can be utilized to make a case that a creator must have played a role in the origin and the design of life. That if intelligent agents, researchers, are required to affect the different steps in the origin of life, and if success is elusive without their involvement, then it means on the conditions of the early Earth, there had to be some kind of divine intervention in order to affect the different steps needed for life to emerge from non-life under the conditions of the early Earth. I call this the empirical argument for God's existence and role in the origin and the design of life. Now, when Creating Life in the Lab was published in 2011, my argument and my complaint about unwarranted researcher involvement was either dismissed or was ridiculed. Interestingly enough, in 2018, in a commentary published in the journal Nature Communications, a German researcher by the name of Clement Reichertz makes this very point when he says it's not easy to see what replaced the flask pipettes and stir bars of a chemistry lab during prebiotic evolution, let alone the hands of the chemists who perform the manipulations. And yes, most of us are not comfortable with the idea of divine intervention. So the point here is that in 2018, Clement Reichertz, in effect, was making the very same point that I was making in my book, Creating Life in the Lab. So the problem here is that you've got this issue of unwarranted researcher involvement. And this issue is beautifully exemplified with the problem of generating what are called biopolymers. These would be materials like proteins, RNA, and DNA, which consist of subunit molecules that are joined together in a linear chain to produce these very large polymeric structures. These polymeric molecules are critical for storing information and for producing enzymes that could catalyze chemical transformations that would be needed to support the emergence of the very first cells. So how do you explain the generation of biopolymers on the early Earth when you have building block materials like amino acids or nucleobases or nucleotides that would be available, the subunit molecules for proteins and DNA and RNA respectively? Well, this is, again, a real problem, and there's a beautiful diagram that is in this paper published by the German researchers where they illustrate the problem nicely. That if you look at the upper left-hand corner of the diagram, you see what researchers do in the lab. Let's say to produce some kind of biopolymer, you would start with high concentrations of the monomers, and you would react A with B and B with C in order to produce these biopolymers in a laboratory where most likely you'd have to have some kind of condensation agent incorporated into the experimental design in order to drive the formation of, let's say, proteins or polypeptides from amino acids. And their point is that if you look in the lower left, the lower left-hand corner of the diagram, in nature, you would have these materials available. They would be in mixtures, and then when they would combine, the mixtures would combine, you'd have this chemically complex setting that would essentially frustrate this reaction. You wouldn't have pure materials, you wouldn't have the right concentrations, you wouldn't have available to you building block materials. You would also have substances that would interfere with the production of these biopolymers. This is called the homopolymer problem that we're not going to get into. So how do you solve this problem of biopolymers, and how do you solve the problem of unwarranted researcher involvement? And this is where this research team enters into the conversation with their work, where they argue that on the early Earth there would have been fissures and cracks in rocks that would have been part of the geological environment of the early Earth, and that these cracks and fissures would be filled with water that would have dissolved in them prebiotic materials like amino acids and nucleobases and sugars, for example. And then they argued that there would be these thermal gradients on the early Earth, and those thermal gradients would effectively create convection currents within these rocks, And they argue that through a process called thermophoresis, you could actually get separation of the mixtures into roughly purified materials that would exist at high concentrations in local environments, giving you the high concentration and the purity you need to drive the production of biopolymers. So it's an interesting proposal that they present, and now they seek to validate that through a series of studies where they set up this microfluidics reactor, which consists of a Teflon block where there was a channel cut into that block. And then they would add mixtures into the channel and then differentially heat that Teflon block, with one side of the block being heated to 40 degrees Celsius, the other side to 25 degrees Celsius. This thermal gradient sets up convection currents that will then separate compounds that are found in mixtures. So they did a number of mixtures to demonstrate, again, this idea that thermophoresis in these cracks, in these fissures on the early Earth could create high concentrations of materials that would be relatively pure. So they started with the mixture of 20 amino acids that are used to build proteins. They showed that you could get this differential separation and concentration of those materials. They did the same thing with nucleobases as well as with nucleotides. And they saw a 3 to 4-fold concentration increase for amino acids and not quite that high of a concentration increase for the nucleobases and the nucleotides. And so on this basis, they argue that this is a mechanism that could be operating on the early Earth that would give you, again, high concentrations of relatively pure materials necessary to drive the formation of biopolymers. Then to demonstrate this, they took a mixture of glycine and added to that a compound called TMP, which is a cyclical triphosphate material that would have potentially been present on the early Earth at very low levels. This is actually a condensation agent that can drive the formation of in this case, diglycine from two glycine molecules. And so this would be a typical type of condensation reaction you would need to create biopolymers of amino acids, leading you to polypeptides and ultimately to proteins. And they noted that when they ran this reaction without any kind of differential heating, without any kind of heat gradient, nothing happened. But when they applied the heat gradient, it looks as if it creates a localized increase in TMP concentration sufficient to drive the production of diglycine. And so then they argue on this basis of this result, we have shown that biopolymerization can take place in these cracks and fissures in rocks on the early Earth. Now, this is a very interesting study. It's a very high-quality study. These researchers have done a great job of showing that thermophoresis taking place due to heat gradients on the early Earth could, in fact, increase local concentrations of prebiotic materials and create relatively pure concentrations in local environments in the rock, which would be necessary, again, for biopolymerization. So they showed that in principle this would work. I've not discussed this, but they went into details characterizing the mechanism that undergirds this process. So they satisfied the first two criteria, but I question if they actually have demonstrated geochemical relevance. Why? First of all, they were working with chemically pristine sets of conditions. They had highly controlled reaction mixtures that they were using to separate these different materials in their reaction vessel, in their microfluidics reaction apparatus. That they were, again, working with chemically pristine sets of conditions. Also, the Teflon block is chemically inert. And of course, this wouldn't be the case on the early Earth, where you would actually have active chemical groups on the rocks that on the surface of the fissures from the rocks that would make up these different geological systems. And so that would actually contribute to the separation of these materials. It might actually make the separation work better, or it may actually inhibit this. So the point here is that this is an interesting study, but they've not really shown geochemical relevance in my mind with this particular system. They need to do more work to establish the geochemical relevance of this work. But in addition to that, they also have done a couple of things that I think are problematic. One is that while creating an increased localized concentration of relatively pure, let's say, amino acids is critical for biopolymerization to take place, it's not enough just simply to have biopolymers that consist of the same amino acid subunit. This does nothing for chemical evolution. What you need is actually information-rich biopolymers, where you would have differing sequences of amino acids, where those differing sequences would actually impact the structure and the function of the protein, creating a variety of functional protein molecules that could support the complexity of the chemistry needed to support life. You would have to have the same kind of information-rich biopolymers for DNA and RNA if they are to store information and then also to function catalytically as well. So in other words, by creating purified systems or relatively pure systems of high concentration, they've made it impossible to have these materials interact in such a way to create the information-rich biopolymers, which would require a chemically complex system in order to achieve that. Also, what they showed in this study is that this system, this mechanism of thermophoresis, could not separate the compounds based on their chirality. Now, what do I mean by that? Whenever you have an organic compound that has a central carbon atom with 4 different chemical substituents, that molecule can exist in 2 configurations in space that turn out to be mirror images of each other, just like your hands are mirror images of each other. This is called the handedness of the molecule. And it turns out that amino acids and proteins are in the left-handed configuration, and the sugars of nucleobases that make up DNA and RNA are in the right-handed configuration. And you have to have a perfect chiral enrichment. You have to have 100% chiral enrichment in order for proteins to form and DNA and RNA to form. And so if you don't have a mechanism to create this chiral enrichment, even if you do get biopolymerization, it's not going to be productive towards the origin of life. So the bottom line is a very interesting study that identifies the role that thermophoresis could play in principle in contributing to chemical evolution, but they really have failed to demonstrate geochemical relevance. And then there's other issues with this work apart from the geochemical relevance that really suggest that maybe this isn't the breakthrough that people think it is, because again, they are creating purified materials, and you really need high concentrations of a complex mixture of amino acids in order to create the information-rich biopolymers required for life. And again, you don't get chiral separation in this system. So bottom line is that they really have not addressed effectively, in my view, the issue of unwarranted researcher involvement. And even though, again, they've identified in principle a process that could contribute to chemical evolution, they also, in my mind, have uncovered additional problems with that mechanism that really raises questions as if this could really truly contribute in a productive way for the origin of life. So bottom line, interesting work, but it doesn't really impact the case for a creator that we made in our book, Creating Life in the Lab, based on the idea of unwarranted researcher involvement. Well, thank you so much for watching this breaking news special edition of Star Cells and God. We hope to do more of these for you in upcoming weeks and months. And so, again, thank you for watching. And I would remind you, again, to follow us on social media, RTB_official. Visit our website, reasons.org, where you can learn about our organization and also give to support the production of Star Cells and God. And then finally, make sure you go to our YouTube channel, Reasons to Believe 1, subscribe, use the notification button, and we would be interested in your comments and your questions. So take advantage of the comments the comments section underneath the video to let us know what you think or what you're thinking about. And then finally, let me just leave you with this idea that the more we know about science, the more we have reasons to believe. Thanks. See you next time.